welcome. Tonight, we're going to explore some of the lesser-known, harsher realities behind one of the world's most famous landmarks, the Great Wall of China and the empire that built it. This is a quiet, steady journey into a long and often difficult past. So take a moment to settle in, adjust your pillow, let your body relax, and prepare to drift off while learning something quietly fascinating. If you enjoy this kind of calming history, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below. We read all of them. In this video, we'll begin with the daily life of the workers who built the Great Wall, how they lived, how they suffered, and why many never returned. Then, we'll take a deeper look at the man behind it all, the first emperor of China, Qin Shi Huang. You'll hear about his rise to power, his fears, and the control he never quite let go of. After that, we'll descend into the strange, still world of the Terracotta Army, thousands of silent soldiers buried underground, guarding a tomb that remains untouched to this day, and eunuchs, people who lived in luxury but under constant watch. And finally, we'll step into the Forbidden Court to understand the quiet, highly structured lives of imperial concubines. It's a slow walk through history, one that asks for no effort from you, only stillness, and maybe a little curiosity before sleep takes over. Let's begin. Imagine standing alone on a narrow ridge, the wind tugging at your thin robe. All around you, nothing but the endless rise and fall of barren hills. The dust bites into your skin. Your feet, wrapped in fraying cloth, sink into loose gravel as you shift your weight. And before you lies a pile of rough stones, each one needing to be hauled, lifted, placed, and pounded into place. If you were lucky, you had a blanket. If not, you learned quickly how to sleep on stone. This is your world now. For most who worked on the Great Wall, the journey began with punishment. Some were prisoners, condemned for crimes, small or imagined. Others were conscripted peasants, pulled from their homes during harvest, handed to the military overseers like sacks of grain. And some were soldiers themselves, demoted, disciplined, or simply forgotten. The fear of being beaten, the fear of losing your food rations, the fear of being abandoned where you fell. There were no uniforms, no proper boots, no applause. Occasionally, a few withered vegetables, or a piece of salted turnip. Meat was rare. When a small animal was caught, it was often reserved for officers or the foreman. Drinking water was sometimes carried up in buckets from nearby streams, but often it came from shallow wells dug into dry soil, stale, cloudy, and metallic in taste. You carried what little you owned on your back, perhaps a small bundle of millet, a worn-out knife, a drinking vessel carved from bamboo, dysentery, malaria, infected wounds. There were no physicians in the camps, only herbal concoctions passed from worker to worker, old remedies with uncertain results. When a man died, there was no announcement. His body would be dragged to the edge of the ridge, buried shallow, if at all. But those who saw it up close, who lived and died by its stones, didn't dream of its legacy. They dreamed of warmth, of rice, of rest. They did not see a wonder. They saw a tomb they had to help build day by endless day. The work would continue to toil. To those who vanished into history without leaving even their names behind. The trek to the wall itself could take weeks, but the terrain was unforgiving, and patrols often found them cold, disoriented, or already lifeless. Punishments for attempted escape were harsh: public beatings, shackles. In some cases, the punishment was death. Not swift, not ceremonial, just quiet and final. Men huddled together for warmth, wrapping themselves in whatever they could find. Conversations were muted, if they happened at all. Voices were hushed, not out of secrecy, but out of fatigue. Most were too tired to speak. Workers were marched in long columns, barefoot or wearing crude sandals, under the watchful eyes of armed escorts. Instead, it was a patchwork sections built at different times, in different places, with different techniques. There was no welcoming committee. No one asked your name. If the tools broke, you would improvise. If your hands bled, you wrapped them and kept swinging. Or you might be assigned to haul sand and earth in woven baskets, climbing steep slopes with the weight of the land pressing down into your spine. Others mixed lime for mortar, their skin burned raw by the chemicals. You were now part of a rotating shift system, working through daylight and often into the moonlit hours. Along the way, some would collapse from exhaustion. The weak and the old rarely made it past the first camp. There were no official cemeteries for these men-just earth, hastily kicked over cold bodies in shallow graves. When you arrived at the wall, you were assigned to a work camp, a scattering of tents or rough shelters. You worked until your legs gave out, or until the overseer's voice cracked the dry air with a command. There were no schedules written on papyrus or silk, only the rhythm of the task, driven by fear. Food was scarce. The hunger was constant, low and gnawing. Your stomach shrank slowly, but never forgot. At night, the camp quieted only a little. The wind didn't. Sometimes, someone would try to escape. Slowly, painfully, it climbed across the landscape. It wasn't a single structure, at least not at first. Some say the wall can be seen from space. The wall was a monument, yes, but not just to defense or pride. It was a monument to hunger. Still, it carries their silence. The work didn't end when the wall was built, only shifted. Once a section was raised high and stretched across a pass or a ridge, it had to be maintained. Wind and rain stripped mortar from between bricks. Earth tremors loosened foundations. Harsh winters split stones apart. Spring floods carried away support ramps and scaffolding. And so the laborers kept returning, year after year, to mend what had crumbled. It clung to your skin, causing itching rashes that cracked in the cold. Completion meant nothing but moving on to the next section. They would observe silently, perhaps ask a foreman for progress reports, and then leave just as quickly as they came. They did not speak to you, the worker. They did not see you. In a way, this made the camps quieter. Over time, you learned who to trust. You were part of the scaffolding in their eyes, necessary but indistinct. If enough men fell ill or died at once, the camp's schedule would falter, drawing the attention of imperial monitors. While modern archaeology has found little evidence of this as a widespread practice, the myth persists in, perhaps, for good reason. The idea that the wall itself is a grave fits the feeling it inspired. Others scratched characters into bricks, a name or a message for future eyes. Few such marks survived, but they remain a whisper from the past, a proof that someone lived, someone hoped, even here. It was not a place of life. And when that happened, the rest of the workers were pushed harder to make up for lost time. Maintenance, in many ways, was no easier than construction. The lyrics changed over time, but the melody stayed simple and slow, easy to remember. A structure that needed constant feeding. It might have told of fields or rivers or the moon, something distant, something peaceful. With so many men in close quarters, sickness spread quickly. Coughs deepened into wheezing. Cuts festered. Fevers stole the senses. There were no healers, no written prescriptions. Remedies were passed from mouth to mouth, like fading superstitions, steeping tea with certain leaves, rubbing mud on sores, binding the limbs with soaked bark. Whether they helped or not was hard to say. And the camp lay under a blanket of frost. You might close your eyes and try to remember the fields back home. A section just 5 meters high could take weeks to complete, and when it was finished, you would turn your head slightly, just enough to see the next empty stretch of land waiting to be tamed. And there was little rest in sight, for even during so-called quiet years, regional warlords, local rebellions, and shifting imperial priorities could reignite building projects with little warning. There was no long-term plan, no architectural blueprint that all dynasties followed. Each ruler added their own section, changed directions, favored different materials. Some used rammed earth packed between wooden frames, a technique that demanded time, coordination, and constant human effort. Even the simplest of tasks wore down the body. No moments of ceremony or remembrance. Occasionally, imperial inspectors would arrive riding on horseback, their robes pristine, their shoes untouched by dirt. What passed for reward was often an extra bowl of millet, a scrap of pork fat, or a single day without lashings. Some overseers were harsher than others. The spoken language varied from region to region. In the rare moments of stillness, usually at night, when the firewood was too wet to burn properly, memory was a fragile comfort, easily shattered by the cold. Disease returned often. When a man died, his body was often left to the side until the day's work was finished. Some legends say that workers who died were buried directly into the wall. Some men carved tiny tokens out of leftover stone or wood symbols of home, good fortune, or old gods. Sometimes you might hear a song-alow, humming tune passed from voice to voice during a moment of rest, but the music never lasted long. The watchman called curfew, torches were extinguished, and silence returned as it always did. By morning, the rhythm resumed. Lift, place, pound, step, carry, haul. The wall was never still, not even when it looked finished. And still, beyond the next ridge, a new camp waited. There were seasons on the wall, though they brought little comfort. Spring was the most tolerable, brief and muddy, with cool mornings and skies often shrouded in mist. The thaw came slowly, loosening frozen earth and softening the hardened mortar between bricks. Occasionally, an outbreak of disease would spread before anyone noticed the fevers again, or coughing that turned bloody. The tents would be quieter for a few days until new voices arrived to replace the old ones. With spring came new arrivals, fresh conscripts, many young and frightened, their hands still soft from village life. Overseers pushed for productivity, citing imperial deadlines and threats of punishment, knowing how quickly their backs would bow, how soon they'd learn to stop asking questions. Workers collapsed, sometimes without a sound. Some would simply sit down in the middle of a path and never rise again. The older ones, those who had worked through multiple seasons, recognized the signs. They knew when a man was done. Lice and fleas returned in numbers, nesting in sleeping mats and biting exposed skin. Rats bred rapidly in the grain stores. Fatigue, after months of non-stop labor, dulled reaction times. Slips became more common. A dropped stone might strike another worker. A misstep on the ladder could send a man falling into the crevice between two sections of wall. Summer, though, was cruel. The heat baked the stones until they scalded your palms. These were rumors, of course, shadows among shadows, but they persisted like the frost. The sun, unrelenting, turned the pale soil into shimmering dust. There was no shade, no reprieve. You returned to the slope, to the stone pile, to the scaffolding. You carried, hauled, stacked. You learned to keep your breath even, your gaze low. You learned not to think too far ahead, because the horizon never changed. It always held more wall. Fires were rare and small. The smell of burning animal dung lingered in the air, harsh, acrid, but warm. Men became gaunt. Conversations slowed, eyes hollowed. The overseers might turn their attention to maintaining camp infrastructure, enforcing shelters, digging drainage ditches, repairing storage containers. You might find yourself standing ankle-deep in freezing water, trying to plug a leak with a handful of straw. There were no scrolls listing your deeds, no monuments bearing your face. The imperial records, if they mentioned you at all, described you in collective terms. 1,000 conscripts deployed, 200 workers lost, 3 new camps established. Hands went numb before sunrise. You worked slower, not out of defiance, but because your body simply would not move faster. Still, the demands remained the same. Water became precious, rationed in cracked clay jars. You learned not to waste a single drop, learned to sip slowly. Let the water rest on your tongue. Imagine it reaching your limbs. Stones dried faster in the heat. Mortar set quickly. The air was sharper, cleaner, filled with the scent of distant smoke, as villagers burned old brush in the valleys below. Some days, the wind was so strong it carried loose bricks from scaffolding. Ropes snapped. Clothing became minimal, just enough to shield your skin from blisters. But the heat still found you. It soaked into your scalp, your shoulders, your bones. No one cried out. There were no dramatic endings, just quiet exits. Autumn brought wind. It tore through the mountain passes like a warning. Autumn was also when accidents increased. The wind made tasks harder. Dry leaves made footing unpredictable. There were no safety nets, no harnesses, just gravity. Winter, however, was the most feared. It arrived without ceremony. Snow blanketed the camps unevenly, hiding stones, freezing tools, and stiffening cloth. Not from mercy, but from necessity. When winter stretched too long, rations dwindled. Food stores ran low. It was during these winters that desperate stories were whispered. Through it all, your name, if you ever had one, faded, and yet you endured. There were moments, rare and brief, when the work paused not because it was finished, but because it had to. Storms rolled in from the horizon, darkening the sky with sudden speed. Thunder echoed across the valleys like distant drums. Workers were ordered to shelter under overhangs, within tents, or beneath scaffolding that creaked ominously in the wind. In those pauses, there was no joy, only waiting. And in that strange silence, too loud to be calming, too soft to be trusted, you remembered how small you were. The rain came down in sheets, soaking every garment, turning dirt to sludge, and erasing the progress of days. A clear night after the first frost meant that winter would be long and bitter. Another might close his eyes during a break and murmur the name of someone lost long ago or just last week. It was not grief, exactly. It was habit, a small, private ritual, to preserve something personal in a place designed to strip identity away. No scrolls, no letters, no carvings detailing their dreams. What they left behind were the stones themselves, stacked, layered, worn smooth at the corners by wind and time, of weight, of days endured. These beliefs, passed among murmurs at the fireside, gave structure to a life that had none. Was it to keep invaders out, to keep subjects in, to please an emperor you had never seen, who would never see you? It was many things at once: a defense, a message, a border, a labor project that spanned centuries and dynasties. Some sections were left incomplete for decades. Others were torn down and replaced by newer visions. It was a living structure in that way, rising, falling, reshaping. You learned who snored, who prayed, who ate their millet slowly, and who devoured it in one bite. You learned which faces grew thinner over time, which ones disappeared. Some parts were rebuilt again and again under Han, Sui, Tang, and Ming emperors. The empire was wide, the population deep. The loss of a few thousand men was regrettable, perhaps, but not disruptive. But by then, your village might be gone, your family moved or passed on. Some chose not to return, settling in nearby hamlets instead, becoming part of the shadow population that lived near the wall's edge. You'd glance at his usual seat during meals, or the bedroll he left behind, and then you'd carry on. They took up work as porters, guides, or sometimes thieves. A few became overseers themselves, harder now, less forgiving, shaped by the same system they once suffered under. A few brought in herbalists, allowed short rests, distributed thicker blankets before winter. They take photographs, pause to admire the view, marvel at the vastness, but they do not see what it once demanded. They did not last long. Their leniency was seen as inefficiency. Orders came from far away, from court advisors and military strategists who never touched a shovel, and they wanted results. Every boot print in the mud that was soon covered by snow. Each era brought new materials, new methods, new mandates, but the rhythm of the work remained unchanged. Mortar turned soft again. Bricks slid out of place, and carefully packed earth slumped into heaps. You'd stare at it for a while, unsure if it meant anything, or if it was just a way to resist being forgotten. The wall, even when it stood still, demanded more. You watched the sky sometimes. The clouds moved fast over the ridges, casting jagged shadows across the land. The wind made voices disappear. Some workers talked about the stars when they appeared. They believed in signs, in omens. A comet meant change. A red moon meant danger. Others spoke less and remembered more. One man might hum a lullaby his mother used to sing. The Great Wall was not a single wall, nor a single idea. The hands that shaped the wall did not live to see the full shape of it. There is no record of what most of them thought. If you were one of them, you might wonder if anything of you would remain. And yet, the wall itself was a kind of memory, a ledger carved into earth and stone, not of names, but of effort. You might have asked yourself, during the long walks between camps, what it was all for. No one answered, but still the wall grew. It was not built quickly. There were lulls, political upheavals, rebellions, changes in leadership, and it required a constant stream of laborers. You were never irreplaceable. Behind you, another was always waiting. Still, among the workers themselves, something like community emerged. Not friendship, exactly, but familiarity. Sometimes, a man you'd worked beside for months would vanish. No one would explain. One evening, you might find a small carving left behind, perhaps a fish etched into stone, or a few characters scratched on a plank. There were overseers who changed things slightly. There was no reward for surviving the wall. When your term ended, if it ended, you were sometimes granted permission to return home. These were men who knew the terrain, and some did return home, quietly, older than their years. They rarely spoke of the wall. What was there to say? It was there before them. It remained after. Today, when tourists walk the restored sections of the Great Wall, they see clean lines, tidy staircases, and railings. They do not feel the weight on the spine, the raw skin of the hands, the cold breath of dawn before work began. They do not smell the thin millet gruel boiled in shared pots. They do not hear the soft footsteps in the frost, or the silence when a worker did not rise. The wall is quiet now, but it remembers. It remembers every dropped stone, every cry swallowed by wind. It is not just a monument to imperial ambition. It is a grave of effort, a place where time and toil and hunger became part of the earth itself. And you were there. He was not born a tyrant. He was born a Prince Ying Zheng in the spring of the year 259 BCE in the walled city of Handan. At the time, China was not yet China. It was a landscape of fractured states, each with its own ruler, its own ambitions, and its own armies. Among these, the state of Qin stood apart, remote in the western frontier, stern in customs, efficient in law, and rising in power. Ying Zheng's birth came during a time of immense turmoil. The palace halls in which he first cried out were filled with whispers of betrayal, bloodshed, and shifting loyalties. His father, a prince of Qin, sent to live as a political hostage in Handan, returned to power in a move of fortune. And so the child was swept from vulnerability to ascendancy before he was old enough to speak with certainty. He grew up behind high walls, under the constant surveillance of tutors and strategists. The Qin state did not raise its royalty in luxury, but in rigor. He learned history as a tool, law as a weapon, and fear as a necessity. He listened to stories of rebellions crushed, officials executed, lands annexed. The air around him smelled of ink and cold iron. By the time Ying Zheng became king at the age of 13, he had already learned to observe everything and trust no one. Regents ruled in his name at first, but the boy was never idle. He watched, he memorized, and, as he grew, he took control quietly, then firmly, then absolutely. He came of age in a kingdom obsessed with order. The Qin state valued efficiency above sentiment. Rewards were granted for military success, and punishments dealt swiftly for failure. There were no aristocratic indulgences, no wasted ceremony. Everything served the state, and Ying Zheng, shaped by this system, began to serve it in turn by molding it into an instrument of conquest. His goal was not simply to rule Qin. He desired all the fractured kingdoms, the warring states, weakened by generations of conflict, were ripe for annexation. And so he began a methodical campaign of unification. He did not rely solely on brute force. He used spies, bribes, alliances, and carefully orchestrated betrayals. Where diplomacy failed, his armies marched. The Qin army was unlike others. It was well supplied, well organized, and governed by strict discipline. Commanders who failed were executed. Soldiers who succeeded were rewarded, even if born low. One by one, the other states, Felhan, Shao, Yan, Wei, Chu, and Qi. It took just under a decade. By the year 221 BCE, Ying Zheng had done what none before him had. He had united the known Chinese world under a single throne. He no longer called himself king. That title was too small. Instead, he declared himself the first Emperor Qin Shi Huang, the origin. But as a symbol, he wore robes heavy with silk and black lacquer. He spoke through officials, never directly. His presence was announced by bells, drums, and kneeling attendants. The surface, the boy from Handan, had not vanished. He still watched. He still doubted. The empire he had built was vast, and in its breadth he saw danger, rebellion, dissent, memory. So he worked to erase anything that did not serve unity. He standardized the script. From farmers in the south to merchants in the north, people would write the same characters. He unified weights and measures. Coins were melted and recast. Roads were built in straight lines to bind the empire together. The axle width of carts was regulated so that all could fit within the same ruts. Everything, down to the smallest detail, became consistent. But consistency, he believed, was not enough. Ideas were threats. Books preserved old ways of thinking. So in 213 BCE, he ordered a purge. Books of poetry, history, philosophy, and dissent were gathered and burned. Only technical manuals on medicine, agriculture, and divination were spared. The past had no place in his vision. Some scholars protested. They were executed. Their families, too. The ash from their libraries rose into the sky like a second sunset, and yet the emperor did not rest. And planes. At each stop, officials bowed. Local governors presented tributes. They were driven by something deeper, by fear. Qin Shi Huang feared death. He feared it not as a natural end, but as a flaw, a defect, something that should be conquered. He summoned alchemists and magicians, men who promised immortality through elixirs and incantations. Some gave him mercury-based potions. Others offered strange herbs or long voyages to mythical islands where immortals were said to dwell. The emperor drank, ingested, and commissioned, hoping to live forever. He did not trust his own sons, nor his court. He surrounded himself with eunuchs and officials whose power depended entirely on his favor. He constructed palaces so vast they became cities within cities, filled with walls, guards, and decoys. And beneath it all, he began to dig. Somewhere, in the plains of Cheyenne, beneath layers of soil, his tomb began to take shape. A sprawling underground empire, a resting place built to reflect the world he had ruled. And to shelter him in the next dot, the walls of the mausoleum would rise high, and to guard him in death, an army would be crafted, silent, eternal, and unlike anything the world had ever seen. But that is for later. For now, Qin Shi Huang still breathed, still ruled, and still feared. His mind, always calculating, turned. Two walls not just around his tomb, but around the empire itself. Walls to keep enemies out, to keep ideas in. And so the Great Wall rose under his orders, fueled by his paranoia, but narrow, a reformer, but one who silenced all questions. He unified a land, yes, with law, with silence, the silence of submission and the silence of the grave. He did not believe in fate. Qin Shi Huang believed in action, deliberate, forceful, unrelenting. He believed that the empire he had forged was not a gift from heaven, but the result of will, of strength, of eliminating everything that stood in his way. And yet, the older he grew, the more restless he became. The grand vision of unity was never enough. New rebellions stirred at the fringes. Court intrigue brewed in whispers. His own body, which had served him so faithfully, began to waver. He did not age gracefully. The potions given to him by his alchemists meant to extend life, to sharpen thought, were often laced with mercury and other poisons. They affected his senses. His moods grew sharper, his sleep more restless, his appetite changed. He became increasingly erratic in travel, ordering sudden journeys, refusing rest, bypassing advisors. The emperor no longer sought peace, chased it, always a few steps ahead, convinced it could be caught if he only stayed in motion. And so he set out again, in the 37th year of his reign, on what would be his final tour of the empire. It was meant to be a demonstration of strength, a declaration that the first emperor still ruled all he saw. He departed with a great entourage: ministers, scribes, soldiers, servants, astrologers, and guards. The caravan stretched across the roads he had standardized, crossing rivers by bridges his engineers had ordered built. Everywhere he went, the people were summoned to watch, to kneel, to offer baskets of dates and grain. Bronze bells rang at every stop. Decrees were read aloud. Imperial banners flapped in the summer wind. But inside his carriage, the emperor was fading. He began to speak less. He grew pale and then yellowed. The energy that had driven conquests and reforms now flickered like a distant torch. His advisors, terrified of instability, hid his condition. Even after his death, somewhere near the coastal district of Shakiwu, they concealed the news. They feared what would come next. They placed his body in a wagon of salted fish, masking the smell of decay with the scent of brine. They continued the journey westward, toward the capital, issuing decrees in his name, even as his lips had already stilled. His body returned to the palace, silent and sealed. The empire, so tightly held in his grasp, was about to unravel. But before it did, his tomb had to be sealed. The great mausoleum project had spanned years. It employed thousands of artisans, engineers, forced laborers, all sworn to silence. The burial site was deep and expansive, modeled after the imperial court. Its passageways mimicked streets. Its ceilings glittered with gemstone stars. Rivers were rendered in mercury, suspended in underground channels to guard it. The terracotta army was assembled, not merely statues, but a full garrison life-sized, each one unique. Warriors in battle formation, chariots, horses, officers, and infantry, all facing outward, ready to defend their emperor in the next life. Their expressions were calm, purposeful. Some looked young, others old. They wore armor, detailed with buttons and straps, carried weapons, many real-edged, now rusted. They were positioned with precision, according to military hierarchy and tactical doctrine. They were not placed randomly, even in death. The emperor demanded order. The craftsmen who created the army were said to have been silenced as well, buried, perhaps, or executed to preserve the secrets of the tomb. Whether this is truth or legend, we may never know, but the fact remains. For over 2,000 years, The tomb remained hidden. The soldiers stood in darkness, their painted faces fading slowly in the dry soil. Qin Shi Huang had ensured that his resting place was untouchable. No one was to enter, and none have. Even today, the central tomb remains sealed. Technology has not yet fully revealed its depths. Fears about mercury, about cave-ins, about loss of artifacts to exposure keep researchers at a distance. The Emperor, in some way, remains undisturbed. Yet the legacy he left above ground was far more turbulent. The unification he achieved dissolved quickly. His son, weak and manipulated by court officials, failed to maintain control. Rebellions flared, cities burned. The dynasty he founded, though powerful, lasted just 15 years. The Han would follow. New rulers, new visions. But the idea of China unified, centralized, had been born. Qin Shi Huang did not live forever, but his shape endured. Even as dynasties rose and fell, even as statues were toppled, the very notion of an emperor over all, under heaven, persisted. His reforms, cruel though they were, gave structure to centuries. His standardizations endured. His punishments, though softened, left echoes in later codes. And the wall, though rebuilt many times, began with his command. But the man himself, he is still difficult to see clearly. Not a villain, not a hero. He was something older, colder, an architect of a nation who trusted no one, a ruler who feared death but ruled by it. And though his name is remembered, his voice is long gone lost in the silence of a sealed tomb. Perhaps that was always the plan. To be remembered, but not reached, to live forever, not in breath, but in stone. To understand a man who tried to rule death, you must also understand what he feared most. Time. Time erodes walls. It unravels dynasties. It dims memory. It bends empires that once believed themselves unshakable. Qin Shi Huang feared that his life, his rule, and his vision would vanish the same way a village disappears in flood season, swept away, scattered, misremembered. So he fought time in the only ways he knew, through stone, silence, and permanence. He waged this quiet war, not just against enemies of the state, but against philosophers, poets, and historians, people who traded in ideas. The past was dangerous to him because it gave people something to compare, something to long for. So he erased it, or tried to. There's a certain irony in the fact that a man who ordered the burning of books is remembered through the fragments that survived him, through the testimonies of later dynasties, the whispered tales. The very historians he silenced became his narrators generations later. The stories of his cruelty, his obsession, his brilliance were shaped not by his will, but by the brushstrokes of scholars he would never have trusted. And so his image is a mosaic, fierce, blurred, incomplete. But if you stood close to the wall, he built the first stones laid under his reign, and listened carefully to the wind curling over the battlements. You might hear something familiar, the rhythm of his thinking, order, unity, fear. These were his pillars. He was not cruel for sport. He was cruel for control. His was a paranoia, not of the mad, but of the calculating. Every crack in the system, every deviation from the pattern was a threat. Even whispers could be fatal. That is why he built walls not only around his borders, but around thought itself. When he unified the writing system, it was not to help the people read. It was to make laws easier to impose, orders clearer to follow, and dissent harder to disguise. When he erased regional currencies and imposed a single coin, it was not for economic harmony. It was for traceability, simplicity, obedience. Even the straight roads he ordered were not merely for trade or travel, they were for troop movements, for inspection tours, for reminders that every village, every district, lay in the emperor's shadow. And yet, for all this planning, he remained deeply unsettled. He had power over land, over people, over laws, but not over dreams. He could not sleep soundly. He sent envoys across the eastern seas to find the immortals said to dwell on distant islands. They never returned, or if they did, it was with lies or silence. He swallowed their pills and drank their tinctures, but the rot inside him grew. He commissioned strange devices, mechanisms to track stars, to consult fate. He consulted diviners, but trusted none of them. He kept lists of omens, but revised them when they displeased him. The line between prophecy and paranoia grew thin, and in the court, as always, trust was in short supply. The emperor believed in systems, not people. He had no confidants, no lasting friends. Even his children were tools, not heirs. The very son he named successor would be manipulated into suicide by court advisors, hungry for their own ends. Qin Shi Huang had built an empire too large for loyalty to grow. It had only room for command and obedience. The officials closest to him knew this. They watched their words, their gestures. A pause too long, a hesitation in a report, a poorly chosen proverb. These could mean exile or worse. Some chose silence, others flattered. All knew that proximity to power meant standing in the wind shadow of a volcano, warm one moment, scorched the next. The emperor aged, but did not soften. He ruled until his body refused to be ruled, and even then his court pretended otherwise, because they feared what he would have feared: a world without the first emperor, the grand lie of the salted fish wagon. Carrying his body, disguised as cargo, is more than an anecdote. It is a perfect echo of the man himself, even in death, manipulated to project strength. The journey back to the capital was long, slow, and filled with dread. The ministers who traveled with the body crafted decrees as if he still breathed. They made plans, chose a puppet successor, sent messages to the outer provinces instructing obedience and patience. They did not mourn, they maneuvered, and back in the heart of the empire, preparations began for the burial. The mausoleum had waited. It was ready. There were some who claimed that lightning struck when his body arrived, that a comet passed overhead, that the animals in the forests nearby fell quiet. These stories are not verifiable, but in the cultural memory, they stuck, because Qin Shi Huang was not just a man. He had become a presence, a silence, a boundary line between before and after. Before him, warlords, shifting borders, scattered peoples. After him, empire, control, ambition written in law and stone. He had tried to become more than human, and in one way he succeeded, not through immortality of the flesh, but through the ghost he left behind, the kind that lingers not in shadows, but in policies, in architecture, in maps. The kind that shapes a nation long after the last of his bloodline turned to dust. His name meant 1st August Emperor of Qin, But he did not intend to be the only. Qin Shi Huang envisioned a dynasty that would endure for 10,000 generations. A line of rulers stretching into the future, each one bearing the mantle he had forged. To him, the state was not a tool for prosperity, was an extension of his own will. As long as the system endured, he endured. But systems built on fear rarely hold when fear itself vanishes. The moment he died, the balance shifted. The ministers who had ridden in silence with his body returned to the capital with secrets. They edited the imperial succession, named his less capable son as emperor, and murdered the rightful heir. Their actions were swift, precise, and politically deadly, but without the sheer gravity of Qin Shi Huang's presence to hold the empire together. Fractures re-emerged. The people had long resented the harshness of the Qin lost, the severe punishments, the endless labor projects, the silencing of thought. Under his rule, even minor offenses were met with brutal sentences. A stolen grain of rice might lead to flogging. A whispered complaint could bring exile. Dissent was not debated. It was extinguished. And yet the empire had endured because of the force of one mind, his purse. Without it, the machinery ground against itself. The first rebellions were small skirmishes, sparked by floods, or famine, or a local governor's cruelty. But the unrest grew. In less than 3 years, the empire was overthrown. The Qin dynasty ended not in a grand war, but in a collapse. It fell inward. The Han dynasty rose from the ashes, more moderate, more enduring. But they did not reject everything the first emperor had done. They kept many of his reforms, his writing system, his weights and measures, his centralized bureaucracy. They softened his legalism, added Confucian ideals, and blended a harsher unity with gentler rituals. But the foundation remained his. It always would. His tomb was sealed, hidden beneath a man-made hill, covered in forest. Above ground, little marked the enormity buried below. The terracotta warriors, placed in separate pits, stood as mute guardians, their presence unknown to the world for more than 2 millennia. They were discovered by accident in 1974 by farmers digging a well. Even then, the full scale of the site remained unclear. Thousands of figures, rows upon rows, each carved with distinct faces, hairstyles, armor, posture, not mass-produced, but individualized, each one representing a person, or perhaps an ideal of a person. Infantry, archers, generals, charioteers, their weapons were real, their hands poised for action. Yet they had stood in silence, in darkness. Since the time of their emperor, their discovery stunned the world, and yet the central tomb remains unopened. Modern science suggests high levels of mercury beneath the earth, consistent with ancient records of rivers of liquid metal created to mimic the geography of China. But without proper tools, any excavation risks irreparable damage. So the emperor still waits. His bones, if they remain, lie deep beneath layers of stone, traps, and secrecy. His court replicated in miniatures, buried with him gold, jade, lacquer, scrolls, entire worlds sealed under soil. He had tried to cheat death and failed, but in the end, he achieved something stranger. He became myth. He became contradiction. The builder of unity and the bringer of terror. A visionary who feared his own people. A man who gave China its name, but tried to erase its past. He was both founder and destroyer. Even his memory is conflicted. In modern times, some celebrate him for his achievements, his unification, his standardizations, his sheer drive. Others revile him for his brutality, his book burnings, his paranoia. Perhaps both views are true. Perhaps they must be, because Qin Shi Huang was not a balanced figure. He was a force, an edge. He carved his rule into history with the tools he understood: best law, labor, silence. And then he buried himself beneath a mountain, surrounded by soldiers who would never speak, sealed in chambers designed to last forever. No emperor has ever ruled as he did. None ever will, but many walked in his shadow, some knowingly, others unaware. His legacy is not just in the stones of the Great Wall or the script on ancient tablets. It is in the way China came to see itself, as one people under one roof, with one heart, a heart he tried to preserve, not through kindness, but through control. As the centuries passed, the forest grew over his tomb. Seasons changed, dynasties rose and fell. The wall he ordered built crumbled in places, was rebuilt in others. Travelers walked past it. Farmers tilled the land above his grave, unaware of the empire resting below. But now, in the stillness of modern excavation, we see him more clearly. Not the man himself. His face is long lost, but his intention, his message, carved in silence. Let there be one wall, one law, one emperor, one order, even if it costs everything. And perhaps, in the quiet moments of the night, standing before the statues he left behind, you might hear the echo of that message, still waiting, still watching, still buried beneath the weight of its own ambition. They stand without voices, ranks upon ranks of silent watchers, frozen mid-march, their gazes locked on a horizon no longer visible. In 1974, a farmer digging a well-struck pottery, not shards, not fragments of a household vessel, but the curved edge of a life-sized head, carved eyes, a mouth, a nose. A soldier, the discovery would unfold slowly, cautiously. Archaeologists arrived. They cleared more soil, exposing shoulders, torsos, helmets. What they unearthed was staggering. An entire army buried in formation, crafted with care, detail, and precision, hidden beneath layers of compacted earth, the terracotta army. But this was not a cemetery. It was not a battlefield. It was a garrisona subterranean military encampment built not for war, but for eternity. It was made to serve in death, to guard an emperor who could not trust silence alone. To understand these statues, what they mean, why they were made, you must first step back and picture the world from which they came. The Qin court believed deeply in the afterlife, but not in rest. The soul, they thought, continued on. And just as the living emperor required protection, tribute, and ceremony, so too would his spirit in the world beyond. Death was not an end. And to staff it, he ordered the construction of an army unlike any before it, crafted from clay. Standing tall, poised, ready. Each soldier in the terracotta army was not merely a figure, they were an individual. No two faces are alike. Some bear high cheekbones and narrow chins, others round faces or tired eyes. Some wear mustaches, others are clean-shaven. Their hairstyles vary by ranked topknots, buns, hair pulled tightly in coils. They are dressed for battle, some in heavy armor, their chest plates layered with riveted tiles. Others were lighter garb, suited for agility. Archers kneel, their hands frozen mid-draw. Cavalrymen stand beside clay horses, whose ears flick forward in permanent attentiveness. Charioteers are positioned in trios, generals. Towering and stern, gaze forward with a calm that borders on divine. Weapons were once held in many hands, bronze swords, spears, halberds, bows. Most of these have been lost or corroded, but traces remain. Some blades were found to be sharp even after 2 millennia, a testament to the metallurgical skill of the Qin artisans. What strikes the observer, even today, is the scale. Thousands of soldiers, an entire military structure rendered in clay, not merely a tribute, but a simulation. And this army was only one part near them. Other figures were found: acrobats, strongmen, musicians, animals, officials, even lifelike stables, complete with feeding troughs. The emperor, in death, would not lack entertainment, nor management, nor service. He would not walk alone. All of this, the vastness, the intricacy, was hidden deliberately. Once completed, the vaults were sealed in rubble and ashdot, and for 2,000 years they remained silent. They were never meant to be seen again. They were built to serve, longer than stone. The soldiers endured not because someone preserved them, but because time forgot them. The soil pressed close, the air stayed dry, and their silence held. But time is not always gentle. When first unearthed, many of the warriors still bore color paints of crimson, blue, black, white, even soft purples and greens. Details once vivid, but exposure to air caused the pigments to flake and vanish in hours. The figures dulled, faded, returned to monochrome. Today, when you walk among them, you see their surface as mottled, pale, and earthen. But once they were vibrant, lifelike, spectral. It's difficult to say how many more remain hidden. Only a fraction of the mausoleum complex has been fully excavated, and at the center lies the emperor himself, his burial chamber, untouched. No one has entered it not since the tomb was sealed. Ancient records speak of a vast underground hall, its floor a map of China, rivers of mercury flowing through bronze, channels, the ceiling painted with constellations, traps set to kill any who enter, crossbows rigged to fire automatically, needed to safely excavate without damage or triggering collapse, is still being developed. And so, the mystery remains intact. Qin Shi Huang still lies in the earth. His body, perhaps, is gone or preserved. No one knows, but the silence he imposed continues. Even today, we stand outside the door. Even today, the army watches. The site, officially known as the Mausoleum of the First Qin Emperor, stretches across the landscape like an invisible city. You see only the surface rolling mounds, earth-colored structures, covered pits, but beneath, hidden corridors. The terracotta warriors are just one section of this hidden kingdom. Archaeologists have uncovered several pits, each with its own role. Pit 1 is the largest rectangle, almost the length of 5 football fields, filled with ranks of infantry and war chariots. Pit 2 contains a more diverse force: archers, cavalry, and command units arranged with precision. Pit 3, thought to be the command post itself, houses a handful of high-ranking officers under a domed structure, more like a temple than a barracks. Each of these pits reveals something not just about the army, but about the mind that commissioned it. Nothing here is random. Even the distances between soldiers are regulated. The formation reflects the military discipline of the Qin state order, hierarchy, preparedness. This was not art for its own sake. It was an extension of reality brought underground. And yet the figures have more in common with sculpture than with mass production. Close examination reveals that each head was crafted using a small number of molds, but the features were altered afterward by hand. Eyebrows carved slightly differently, mouths tilted just so, eyes widened or narrowed. The result, an illusion of individuality across thousands of forms. Even the soles of their shoes are detailed. Even the ears are different, and still they were never meant to be viewed by the living. This was not a public monument. It was an act of faith or of control. Perhaps both. Qin Shi Huang believed, or feared, that the afterlife would be much like this one, that his enemies would follow him, that he would require protection, authority, familiarity, and so, in a way, he brought the empire with him in miniature. One of the more haunting details is the absence of names. The figures do not have inscriptions. We do not know the artists. We do not know the laborers who molded the clay, who shaped the fingers, who painted the eyes. Their identities, like the souls of the soldiers they depicted, are unrecorded. There are theories, of course, that workshops across the empire contributed parts, that the artisans were drawn from the best of conquered states, especially Shu, known for its craftsmanship, that the workers, once finished, were killed to preserve secrecy. None of these theories can be confirmed, but the silence is instructive. Qin Shi Huang controlled his world so thoroughly that even the creators of his legacy disappeared into anonymity. What mattered was not who made the statues, but that they stood, ranked forever. Sometimes fragments are found. A thumb here, a broken foot, a horse's ear. These pieces are treated with care, reassembled like bones in a museum of ghosts. There are even signs of ancient restorations, as if the workers had revisited damaged statues, patching them before sealing the chamber. It suggests the army was not made in haste. It was refined, perfected, then shaped like a pyramid, softened by time. But beneath it, according to ancient records, lies the emperor's chamber, sealed behind bronze gates, surrounded by traps and poison. The book of the Grand Historian, written a century after the emperor's death, describes it. Rivers and seas of mercury were set flowing mechanically, above which the heavenly constellations were shown. Crossbows were rigged to shoot at intruders. The craftsmen who built it were buried alive, so they could not reveal its secrets. It sounds fantastical, and yet modern surveys have confirmed extraordinarily high levels of mercury in the soil above the tomb. Something is down there, but it remains sealed, out of respect, out of fear, out of uncertainty. Opening the chamber could release toxins. It could damage fragile artifacts. It could destroy texts written on silk or bamboo. Until technology offers a safe method, the central tomb will remain a secret. And so, the terracotta army stands as both prelude and warning, a glimpse of what was meant to be hidden, a reminder that some monuments were made not for memory, but for power. Even now, visitors walk the narrow platforms overlooking the pits. They look down into the trench where thousands of soldiers stand at attention. The silence is deep, but not empty. The air feels different still, but charged, because in these figures something ancient lingers, not life, but intention. The terracotta army is not simply a relic of ambition, it is a reflection of belief to modern eyes. It may seem strange to create an entire army out of clay, to bury it underground, never to be seen again. But in the worldview of the first emperor and his court, such acts were not symbolic, they were real, necessary, practical preparations for a continuation of rule beyond the grave. The afterlife, as imagined by the ancient Chinese, was not a realm of rest, but a mirror of the world above, a place where bureaucracies continued, where titles held meaning, where conflict remained a possibility. And so, just as the living emperor required guards and advisors, so too would his soul. This belief was not unique to the Qin. Across early Chinese dynasties, tombs were stocked with items for the deceased to use: vessels, weapons, furniture, even models of granaries or homes. But Qin Shi Huang's scale was unmatched. He had ruled all under heaven, and so he expected to rule again. But there's another layer to consider, not just belief, but strategy. The emperor did not rely on the spirit world alone. He built defenses, traps, secrecy. The underground complex was designed to repel intrusion, human or otherwise. It suggests that Qin Shi Huang did not view the afterlife as serene. He anticipated attack, betrayal, uprising. Perhaps he feared that his enemies, so thoroughly crushed in life, might return in another form, perhaps deep down. He understood that power breeds resentment and that even death could not erase the weight of what he had done. And so he built an army not of flesh and blood, but of earth and fire, immortal. In a way he was not. And yet, for all this preparation, the warriors do not move. They stand, their eyes unblinking, their weapons long removed or rusted, their feet rooted in trenches carved millennia ago. They were made to wait, and so they have. There is something haunting about their patience. They do not protest their fate. They do not beg for light. They exist in a space between reverence and abandonment. Some show cracks, not the result of violence, but of time. The first pit to be excavated revealed just how fragile the site was. When the roof beams collapsed, intentionally burned during sealing, they damaged many of the statues. Restoration took decades. Some figures were rebuilt from dozens of shards. Others were left as they were, fragments of a forgotten army. And yet, even these broken pieces seem to carry presence. A soldier's face, half gone, still seems to watch you. A horse's flank, missing its legs, still breathes with the curve of motion. There is an intimacy in this quiet ruin. You begin to understand that this army was not only built to serve, but to witness, to stand guard over the emperor's silence, to ensure that his control, which extended over all he touched in life, remained unchallenged in death. And still, we know so little. No contemporary records survive from the emperor's reign that describe the army. The book of the Grand Historian, compiled decades later, offers only glimpses. The emperor himself left no personal writings. His orders were transmitted by decree, short, final, irreversible. So we look to the clay, we study the kill marks on the backs of heads, the variations in craftsmanship, the mineral content of the paints. We piece together the production process, how the bodies were assembled from parts, how the legs were built hollow to support weight, how the heads were fired separately and then attached. We analyze fingerprints found on the surface of the figures, actual traces of the artisans who shaped them, men whose names are lost, but whose touches endure. It is easy to forget, amid the grandeur, that the terracotta army was made by human hands, laborers, craftsmen, assistants working in massive workshops, perhaps under tight deadlines and constant oversight. Some may have taken pride in their work, others may have feared it. Some may have understood what they were building, others may have known only the next task, the next deadline. The emperor demanded not only obedience, but scale. He asked for the world, reproduced in clay, and they gave it to him, piece by piece, statue by statue, silence by silence. There is a quietness to the sight that no crowd can break. Even as visitors walk along elevated platforms, their footsteps hushed by soft flooring, their voices reduced to whispers by the sheer solemnity of the scene, the terracotta army remains, unmoved, and perhaps that's the most profound aspect of it, all its stillness, not the stillness of abandonment, but of vigil, as if they are waiting for something, or someone. And yet, deep beneath the surface, under the hill that marks the tomb's center, is a space even more silent, uninterred, unexplored. The actual burial chamber of Qin Shi Huang remains untouched, hidden beneath centuries of soil and secrecy. We know little, but enough to imagine. Texts speak of flowing mercury rivers and seas, placed to mimic the geography of China, a celestial ceiling overhead, with constellations drawn in pearls and glowing stones, a floor that reflects the heavens, and walls lined with the names of mountains and borders. The emperor would rest at the heart of this symbolic empire in life. He ruled the world he could see. In death, he would rule a world made to reflect it. But that tomb is more than a burial site. It is a statement, a declaration that power should not end, that death is only a transition of domain, not a surrender of authority. It is also, in its own way, a trap, not just physically though. The texts warn of crossbows, hidden chambers, and mechanisms designed to kill-boot ideologically. For those who seek to understand the emperor, the sealed tomb becomes a temptation, the last secret of a man who tried to erase mystery and yet created the greatest one of all. And so far, it has held, not from lack of curiosity, but because of a decision to wait, to develop technology that can see into the chamber without destroying it, to preserve what little is left before exposing it to air, to light, to time. There's something poetic in that hesitation. The emperor who rushed to conquer, who feared time, who feared decay, is now protected by the very patience he lacked. His silence is being preserved, not out of fear, but out of respect. And still, there is the question, who built this? Not just the sculptors or the engineers, but the minds who imagined it, who proposed burying a whole army, who designed the layout, the proportions, the expressions. Did they believe in what they made? Did they think the soldiers would rise again? Or were they simply obeying, shaping stone and clay with tired hands, afraid to ask why? There's no way to know, but the details speak volumes. Tiny rivets in armor plates, tied belts with sculpted knots, the weave of cloth in clay sleeves, the curve of a lip suggesting calm, determination, or weariness. These are not hurried works, they are intimate, and yet, once buried, they were never meant to be seen again. No torches were left burning. No records pointed to their location. They were placed in the dark, and the earth was packed down. This was the final instruction. Let them disappear. And so they did, until accident revealed them once more. Today, we walk among them like trespassers in a sacred space. We look into the eyes of statues who were not made to look back. We photograph them, write about them, wonder at them, and the emperor, wherever he may be, remains silent. His tomb may never be opened, or perhaps it will be slowly, cautiously, respectfully. But even then, even if we see the rivers of mercury, even if we find his bones or robes or jewels, we will never truly understand the mind that commanded all this, because the terracotta army was not made to tell us something. It was made to hide something, a fear, perhaps, a hunger for control, so total that even death could not be trusted to unfold without planning. And maybe that's why they still stand, motionless and mute, not in tribute, not in memory, but in defense, against chaos, against forgetting, against the final loss of a man who refused to be lost. And as we walk away, leaving behind this underground world of stillness and stone, we may wonder what lies beneath our own empires, our own ambitions. What will remain of us once the noise is gone? Clay, perhaps, and silence. Behind the outer walls of the palace, beyond the stone lions and the lacquered gates, was a second world, a world of still corridors and shaded courtyards, a world where footsteps were softened by silk shoes, where conversations never rose above murmurs, where every glance was measured and every smile had weight. This was the inner court of imperial China to most. It was known simply as Nei Ting, the inner palace, but in time and in memory it would take on a more poetic and more oppressive name, the Forbidden City, and within it, life was both luxurious and profoundly constrained. If the emperor was the son of heaven, then the forbidden court was his. Celestial households spended between ceremony and confinement. Those who lived inside were not simply inhabitants. They were part of a living system, an elaborate breathing ritual that unfolded day after day, season after season, year after year. For many, this world was entered young and rarely if ever left. Again, let us begin with the concubines. They did not choose the palace. They were chosen often from noble or official families, sometimes from poor households. Young girls were selected and presented for imperial service. The process was careful, ritualized. Physical beauty played a role, but so too did temperament, posture, voice, and lineage. Once chosen, a girl might undergo training in etiquette, music, calligraphy, and how to dress, speak, and walk with measured grace. She would enter the palace through a gate that only opened inward. Once closed, it rarely opened again. Inside, she received a new name, sometimes a new title. Her identity outside the court faded. Her family might be rewarded or forgotten. She now belonged to the emperor, but this belonging did not guarantee proximity. The imperial harem could contain hundreds of women, even over 1,000 during certain dynasties, and yet only a few were ever summoned. Most lived in quiet apartments, waiting, hoping. Their daily routines were highly structured. They rose before dawn. Attendants arrived with water for washing, trays for morning tea, Robes were selected seasonal, silks in appropriate colors, often matching the mood or occasion. Hair was arranged in ornate styles, accessories chosen not for fashion, but for rank. Then the day began. Lessons, embroidery, poetry, or idle hours in the garden if weather permitted. Conversations were gentle, indirect. Friendships formed and dissolved based on rumor, on the emperor's shifting interest, or on the movements of palace officials. Every action was observed, every word remembered. There were no secrets in the forbidden court, tonally whispered truths at any moment. A name might be called, a message delivered in silence. The emperor has summoned you. What followed was a ritual, preparation, bathing, scenting the skin with rare oils, dressing in a robe of evening silk, then the slow walk to the chamber, often accompanied by an older attendant, eyes cast down, heart silent, and then, perhaps, a night with the emperor, or not. Even the summonings could be political gestures. Sometimes the emperor merely sought conversation. Sometimes the night ended quickly, without intimacy. Sometimes a new favorite emerged. Sometimes a woman would not be called again. If she bore a son, her position changed. She might rise. She might earn the emperor's favor, the title of consort, or even empress. If she did not, she might fade. Decades could pass within the walls of the inner palace, without ever seeing the world beyond. And yet, the palace was not a prison in the traditional sense. There were gardens, pavilions, libraries, temples, festivals, but freedom was shaped by visibility. You were never alone. Never unwatched. You lived in gilded stillness. You learned to read tone, silence, the shifting of the wind. For a concubine, survival meant adaptation not only to hierarchy, but to rumor, to favor, to the unseen rhythms of power, and even among themselves. The women were rarely allies. A favored concubine could ensure her family's rise in society. An empress could control court appointments, but a careless word, a small misstep, could lead to demotion, or worse, exile from the court. Return to a world that had already forgotten your name. In some dynasties, palace intrigues ran deep, poisons in tea, accusations of sorcery, secret alliances with eunuchs or courtiers. The beauty of the forbidden court lay in its surface, calm. Its danger lay beneath. And then there were the eunuchs, men who had been altered to serve in the one place where men were forbidden. To serve in the forbidden city, a man had to leave part of himself behind. Literally, eunuchs, castrated men were the only male servants permitted within the inner court, allowed near the emperor's wives, concubines, and female attendants. The logic was simple, cruel, and centuries old, without the capacity for sexual relations. A eunuch could be trusted not to violate the sanctity of the emperor's household, but trust in the palace was never absolute, only conditional, and so even the eunuchs were watched. Their origins varied. Some were the sons of poor families, sold or given up in exchange for money, for status, or for a better life. Others, orphaned or enslaved, found no other path to survival. A few, driven by ambition or desperation, chose the procedure themselves, knowing that in a world where birth determined fate, castration could be a door, a painful one, but a door nonetheless. The procedure itself was harrowing, often done in secret, with rudimentary tools and no anesthesia. Many did not survive. Those who did were marked for life, not just physically, but socially. Yet within the walls of the forbidden city, a eunuch could rise. They were trained from a young age: cleanliness, discipline, silence. Their duties ranged from the mundane to the profound. Some swept halls and tended lamps. Others served meals to concubines, recorded the emperor's decrees, maintained palace documents, or tended to the imperial wardrobe. And a few rose much higher, because unlike most palace staff, eunuchs could remain close to the emperor, always within reach, always nearby, trusted to deliver letters, to attend to private matters, to observe quietly the unfolding of power behind closed doors. In this closeness, opportunity grew. A clever eunuch might learn how to read, might gain the confidence of a prince, might master the rhythms of palace life so completely that he could predict decisions before they were made. And in certain dynasties, particularly during the later Ming period, eunuchs became some of the most powerful figures in China. They managed vast financial networks. They appointed officials. They led military campaigns. They built fleets. Zheng Hai, the famed admiral who sailed across the Indian Ocean in the 15th century, was a eunuch. But power came with risk. Eunuchs were resented by the scholar official class, who viewed them as uneducated interlopers, manipulators, corrupt. Histories written by these officials often paint the eunuchs as villain symbols of dynastic decay. Some of that resentment was political. Some of it was earned. Many eunuchs did become corrupt. Some siphoned imperial funds, sold access to the throne, or manipulated succession. But others were simply survivors of a system that left them with few choices and no protections. And at the lowest levels, life was hard. Junior eunuchs slept in cramped quarters. They worked long hours. Their tasks were endless and sometimes demeaning. Cleaning chamber pots, washing linens, waiting in silence for hours to deliver a single scroll. Their every action was constrained by hierarchy. And above all, they were dispensable. An error, a rumor, even an unlucky association could end a eunuch's career or life. Some were cast out of the palace, forced to wander in poverty. Others were executed quietly, buried without names. But for those who succeeded, who endured, who learned to read the court like a map, the forbidden city became a labyrinth they could master. They knew who spoke to whom. They knew which consort's star was rising. They could predict illness by the contents of an imperial meal. They could shape the tone of a decree by the timing of its delivery. And for an emperor, isolated by divinity, surrounded by ritual and deference, the company of eunuchs often became a kind of strange intimacy. Not friendship, exactly, but familiarity. The kind that arises when someone helps you into your robes. Every morning, when someone knows the pattern of your appetite, your sleep, your silence. Some emperors came to rely on their eunuchs more than their ministers, and sometimes the consequences were immense. One whispered. Suggestion. One frowned during a council. One intercepted letter. That was enough to change the direction of a reign. But influence did not mean freedom. Even the most powerful eunuch remained within the walls, always watched, always contained, like the concubines they served beside. Their lives unfolded in carefully measured space, day after day, year after year. The forbidden city was beautiful, imposing, meticulously kept. but it did not forgive. The days in the Forbidden City passed slowly from the outside. Its golden roofs shimmered beneath the sun, its red walls towering like a fortress. But inside, the hours unfolded with ritual precision, each moment part of an invisible choreography that few ever saw, and even fewer understood. Morning came with the striking of the palace bell. The sound rolled across tiled courtyards and beneath carved eaves, low and round, calling the day into motion. The concubines stirred first, roused by their personal maids. Before light filled the rooms, water was drawn for washing, robes laid out, hairpins placed in tidy rows. In another part of the compound, the eunuchs began their routines, some sweeping corridors in long, deliberate arcs, others preparing incense for the morning audiences. Their hands practiced, movements silent throughout the Forbidden City. The day did not begin with noise, but with discipline. Even the sparrows seemed to chirp more softly here. The morning court assembly took place beyond the inner court, where high officials gathered to hear or deliver the emperor's instructions. Few women, and only select eunuchs, were permitted to attend. Those who did observed from the edges, still expressionless. Back in the inner quarters, concubines returned to their more confined schedules. Some were assigned to embroidery halls, others to musical rehearsals. Some practiced poetry or copied texts onto silk, their brushes gliding with patient grace. These tasks were not simply for leisure, they were performances of refinement, proof of worthiness. To be idle was to risk suspicion. To excel too brightly was to invite jealousy. One had to walk a narrow path between invisibility and attention. Meals were structured affairs, delivered in trays lacquered in black and gold. Portions were small but elegant. Certain ingredients, ginseng, bird's nest, rare fungi, were reserved for the higher-ranked women. Lower-ranked concubines received simpler fare, though always dignified in presentation. EUNUCHS 2-8, modestly often apart, squatting on benches inside kitchens. Their food was plain but sufficient, and they ate quickly, sometimes in shifts, depending on their rank. But even the food was political. Every dish served to the emperor was tasted beforehand, sometimes by EUNUCHS, sometimes by concubines who had fallen from favor. No gesture in the palace was without meaning. No gesture was ever forgotten. In the afternoons, the palace quieted, a time for rest, for private thoughts, or, more often, for quiet tension. This was when rumors traveled the fastest, carried unfolded notes, sideways glances, or overheard phrases beneath the shade of a silk fan. And always the hierarchy lingered. Concubines ranked according to imperial favor and rigid protocol, from the empress at the top, down through consorts, noble ladies, talented women, and so on. Each title came with specific privileges: number of attendants, size of chambers, patterns embroidered on one's sleeves. A single mistake could cause demotion. A whispered accusation could lead to disgrace. And for eunuchs, ranks existed as well. The lowliest swept corridors or fanned braziers in the winter. The highest kept the emperor's seal, managed correspondence, or coordinated entire departments. Promotions came rarely, and only with the backing of powerful figures from the emperor himself or an empress with influence. But all lived under the same sky, They walked the same red paths. They watched the seasons change from the same stone steps. And though the Forbidden City was vast, over 8,000 rooms, stretching across hundreds of acres, it could feel unbearably small. The windows, while large, rarely opened fully. The walls, while decorative, never moved. Time, for those inside, became something different. The outside world faded. Years passed like ripples on a still pond. There were no dates to mark except imperial festivals, birthdays, the occasional firework heard from the distance beyond the gates. News from outside was filtered, curated. A rebellion might be spoken of as a disturbance, a flood as a minor upset. The palace insulated as much as it imprisoned, and within its calm, a strange intimacy grew, not just between people, but with the palace itself. Concubines knew which floor tiles creaked in which corridors. Eunuchs knew the smell of rain on the roof beams, the exact moment the sun would pass between two columns in late spring. They lived inside a breathing monument, and the monument remembered them, even if history would not. There were seasons in the Forbidden City. Though they passed like whispered stories, in spring, peonies bloomed in the inner gardens, their petals folding open like tiny declarations. Concubines walked slowly beneath the flowering trees, their sleeves brushing softly against one another. Sometimes the emperor would appear in the garden without warning, and the entire atmosphere would shift. Posture straightened. Conversation ceased. Eyes lowered. Summer arrived with weight. The stone courtyards radiated heat. The palace walls, thick as fortresses, trapped the warmth like ovens. Fans waved endlessly. Cold drinks were brought in bowls of jade and glass. Perfumed water was sprinkled on floors. Still, the air remained heavy. Slow dot. Autumn brought color. The ginkgo leaves turned gold. The skies sharpened into clearer blue. Lantern festivals filled the evenings with soft light, and concubines wrote poems for the occasion, each trying to impress without appearing too eager. Winter silenced everything. Snow fell over the rooftops in clean lines, outlining every curve and pillar of the palace with surgical precision. Fires crackled in brazier urns. Robes thickened. The breath of eunuchs curled in the air as they lit lanterns before dawn. And through all these changes, the palace remained constant, a still heart at the center of an empire. But beneath that stillness were people, women who had once been daughters, who once knew the sound of a family name spoken in warmth, men who had once dreamed, perhaps, of a life with more sky above their heads. Some concubines grew old within those walls, never called, never favored. Their titles faded with time. Eventually, if they lived long enough, they might be granted a quiet corner of the palace in which to pass their final years. Others died young of illness, of childbirth, of sorrow. A few became powerful. A select few rose to empress, or wielded influence through sons who became emperors themselves. But even then, their lives were negotiated through ritual and surveillance. Every relationship was political. Even love, if it existed at all, was secondary to protocol. As for the eunuchs, their fate was no less complex. Some served loyally for decades. They became fixtures of the court-walking encyclopedias of etiquette, tradition, and memory. When they died, they were sometimes buried near the palace in modest graves, marked only with a title. Others fell from grace swiftly, a missed message, a misjudged alliance. And the same emperor who had once relied on them might order their removal without a word. And yet, many eunuchs, perhaps more than anyone else, understood the full rhythm of palace life. They saw everything, heard everything. They knew who wept quietly behind closed doors. They knew which concubines sent secret gifts to which ministers. They knew the emperor's moods, the empress's fears. The weight of every decision passed from hand to hand in scrolls, too carefully worded to be trusted. They were the pulse behind the pageantry, and still they were invisible. History often remembers emperors by name, but forgets those who stood closest to them. And perhaps that is the nature of power, not only to rule, but to absorb, to erase the details that support its foundation. In the final analysis, the Forbidden Court was not only a physical space, but a way of life, a palace that was both golden and gray, dream that was also a trap. Those who lived within its walls did not live ordinary lives, but neither did they live freely. They existed in a state of suspended identity, where their individual stories were constantly shaped and reshaped by their usefulness to someone else. And yet, they endured. The concubine who memorized the emperor's favorite poems, hoping to be chosen again. The eunuch who mastered calligraphy, just to write a single decree beautifully enough to be noticed. The old servant who tended incense for 30 winters, never once speaking out of turn. Each of them lived lives of quiet tension, of beauty laced with caution, of comfort edged with silence. Today, when visitors walk the marbled paths of the Forbidden City, they often marvel at the scale, the vast gates, the golden roofs, the endless repetition of symmetry and color. But the real life of the palace was not in its stones. It was in the pause before speaking, in the way a woman bowed, in the silence after a door closed. The Forbidden City was never truly about the emperor alone. It was about the world built to contain him, and to contain everyone else who lived in his shadow. And when you leave its gates, back into the noise of the present, you might carry with you a whisper of that silence, a stillness not of peace, but of permanence, of lives lived so carefully that they vanished without echo, but not without weight.